Welcome to this edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow at Tarleton State University, and we welcome you as we do each week at noon on Sundays right here on KTRL 90.5 FM, and also streaming live, or not really live to tape as we like to say it, but streaming on tarletonradio.com. And also you can listen to us on SoundCloud. You can download previous episodes and listen. You can download where you get your podcasts. We're available in a lot of formats, and it's good to be back on the air. We were back last week after being off the air for a month, and part of that was to address some other issues and things that needed attention, but now to get back to our weekly show and to focus on very critical issues at both the state and federal level, and occasionally local issues as well. Last week, we had the great privilege of interviewing Jane Hickey, longtime assistant of Governor Ann Richards, and listening to a little bit of her a background that she offered on working for the former governor, working for in that environment, especially as we look at the legislative session and where we are, and of course the role of the governor in that as well. So again, welcome this week. This is a show without an interview this week. We'll have some coming up in the weeks ahead, but there are a lot of issues that I wanted to cover, some things I wanted to go back and pick up on, especially the debate over voting and voting security and restrictions as we see some of the challenges with terminology. Also wanted to look at and revisit the challenges of electrical supply, energy supply in Texas, as we did an interview back in February with Dr. Ann Eggleston, and we talked about what led up to the crash of the electrical system in the state. And of course, now the news in recent days that we are having some challenges and could possibly have some in the summer as well. And then also at the end of the show, we want to look at the GOP frontrunners. So is it too early to be talking presidential politics for 2024 as we look to the midterm elections in 2022? And we'll look at who may be positioning themselves to, especially when we talk about dollars, where are supporters going? Where are they looking in terms of potential candidates for the GOP nomination for the 2024 presidential election? But first, I want to go to the issue of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been in the focus for a while now. We look back several years, the nominations and appointments by President Trump, the debate over the Supreme Court that entered into the presidential race, especially with Trump's last appointment being as the race was moving toward the election. And of course, the back and forth between Republicans and Democrats over what had happened and what Republicans had done, installing on Merrick Garland at the end of the Obama administration and saying, well, we need to wait and let the voters speak and address this in a new election or election that's coming up and see who the voters determine as president. So there's been a number of things focused here. And of course, most recently in the last week or so has been the movement by the Biden administration to appoint the commission to look at the Supreme Court and really to study this issue about the number of justices. So we know this debate revved up during the presidential election campaign when, because of Trump's appointments, some in the Democratic Party started pushing and saying we need to raise the number of justices. If we get control of Congress, Congress is the one designated by the Constitution to determine this. It's not set. Then the consideration of looking at adding justices in order to counter the Trump appointments, which, if you look at this in terms of political ideology and where the candidates fall, some would say, okay, this gives the Republicans or conservatives a 6-3 advantage on the court. Now, first of all, I want to point to that and say that is politicizing the Supreme Court. And we know and we have to realize that is a factor because these are presidential appointments. But we also have to realize, too, that people appointed to the court are there until they resign or for life. They are there in terms of their legacy, and they're concerned about that as well. And sometimes it surprises us the way people decide on various issues in trying to interpret the Constitution and constitutional law. So looking back at the history of this, just to kind of catch everyone up and talk about this for just a moment, is that in the history of this, we're looking back and seeing that, early on, 3 justices, a 4th is added. It's not until 1869 that the number of justices as we have it today was set. 1867 was set at 9 justices as we have it today. And it has remained at that level throughout all of the time since, even during the attempts of Franklin Roosevelt in his second term to look at the issue of expanding the number of justices, given the Supreme Court's role in striking down many of the programs that he was proposing to try to bring the country out of depression, to try to strengthen the power of the federal government in navigating this very difficult time. Now, Roosevelt was able to accomplish some things, and this is where some think that Biden's focus may be, is that the move by Roosevelt at that time, even though it did not succeed in getting more seats on the Supreme Court, it did succeed in loosening up the Supreme Court and its view and its positioning on certain Roosevelt policies that were able to go into effect. Some are thinking that that's a part of Biden's rationale, at least in the political engagement with the role that the Supreme Court has and what may be coming to the forefront during his administration. So that is a little bit of background that helps us to engage with this very highly politicized issue, which we'll talk about that part of it in a moment. I want to bring in a couple of other factors for us to think about as well. One is that polling, if we want to look at this in terms of public opinion, while yes, a larger number of Democrats favor adding seats to the court compared to overwhelmingly a large number of Republicans, if you average all this out, the consensus, we'd say the majority of people are not in favor. It's a slim majority, but it's enough to say, okay, this is not really as prominent an issue as maybe it's getting attention by politicos and by Republicans, Democrats, and so forth. So polling is not supporting this. The second thing is the actual makeup of the commission and really the power that it's been given. So if you look through the several press releases from the White House, if you look through the committee appointments, if you look through the executive order appointing or creating the presidential commission on the Supreme Court, there are some concerns here. One is that it is the membership of the committee, while it says that it's bipartisan, it's very heavily includes those that would be identified with a liberal or progressive ideology, even though it is many people who are leading constitutional scholars, teaching in law schools and engaged with this with varied experience with the federal courts and so on. So it's an impressive group of people by far, but it's also very clear that there is an attempt to focus on where this call is coming from. And we see it within some of the elements of the Democratic Party that are saying the only way that we can address this to bring back balance to the Supreme Court is to add seats to the court. And in saying that, I want to go to a clip that I want us to share with you that was the press conference that was offered on the occasion of announcing new legislation that has been proposed in Congress. You had Senator Ed Markey, you had Representative Jerry Nadler, who came out and announced this new legislation that was being proposed in Congress to increase the number of seats on the court by 4. So let's listen to this, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the other elements of that.
So we are here as a coalition beginning this effort to ensure that we restore justice to the Supreme Court. This is an incredible moment as we introduced the Judiciary Act of 2021. We are here today because the United States Supreme Court is broken. It is out of balance, and it needs to be fixed. Too many Americans view our highest court in the land as a partisan political institution, not our impartial judicial branch of government. Too many Americans have lost faith in the court as a neutral arbiter of the most important constitutional and legal questions that arise in our judicial system. And I'm disappointed to say that too many Americans question the court's legitimacy. The consequence is that the rights of all Americans, but especially people of color, women, and our immigrant communities are at risk. The concerns the American people have about the High Court are legitimate, and they are well-founded.
All right. So hearing from Senator Ed Markey and hearing the what they are offering as the justification for this really highlights that call from within the Democratic Party of leadership who is attempting to address what happened during the Trump administration with the appointment of judges and what they perceive to be that imbalance. So where is this going to go? I think that's the question now. And of course, Republicans are reacting to this very negatively in terms of court packing. There's also even some current and former justices have come out with concerns about this becoming not just political, but what precedent it sets for the future. And so I think one of the things we have to look at is what authority does the commission have, which first we have to say very little. It's not even charged really in making recommendations. It's more to study the issue, which if we look back historically of these types of commissions and what they've done, it's often been a way of deflecting criticism or deflecting a focus on a particular issue in order to kind of kick it down the road a little bit, which Biden has already done, which he did in the general election, in the debates, when he kind of talked about saying, well, we need to study this. He wouldn't come out and say, yes, we need to increase the size of the court. So this is another way of kind of pushing it off to say, okay, let's let this commission study it for 6 months or so, and then we'll come back and we'll see what they offer to determine if there's a way forward with this. Of course, 6 months from now, we're going to be we're going to be in that midterm election cycle. What other issues, what will be relevant at that point and what will not be. This is a way of addressing concerns, and it looks like that Biden is doing this within his party in a way to say, okay, we're going to take a look at it, but not in a way that overcommits him to actually do something. And I think one of the reasons for that, and we also see this, I think, in the response of Nancy Pelosi that said about this legislation that's being proposed, that it's not going to come to the floor. She has already come out saying that this is not going to move forward in the House. One, you have to look, it's a very close a majority that they have that could change in the next election. But also, I think President Biden and Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, are both institutionalists. I think they both, in their careers and how they have worked within government, have emphasized the importance of the institutions in the way that they are and how they function. And trying to really protect that in some way over against the winds of politics that change with every election and that change with every issue. And so this is something that really steps across that line and looking back at how the Supreme Court has worked. And I don't know that they fully agree with Ed Markey and Jerry Nadler and others that this is out of balance or this is broken. They may agree, yes, well, now conservatives have a majority on the court, and this is going to impact court decisions for decades to come. This is going to be a concern about civil rights issues and other things, which, again, I think there's some legitimacy there looking back historically at the institution. But on the other hand, I think it's the role then of Congress and the president to engage with these issues in a substantive manner that appeals to the role that the Supreme Court has in interpreting the Constitution and trying to navigate some of these very difficult issues in the public square that address, some of the current challenges that we're facing in our society that are going to come to fruition through the legal system and possibly end up with the Supreme Court. So I think both Biden and Speaker Pelosi are looking at this in answering the dissent, the concerns in their party in a way of giving it attention, giving it significant attention to say we need a presidential commission on this, but not in a way of, okay, we're actually going to do something about this. We're actually going to seriously consider whether we should expand the number of seats on the Supreme Court. I think we'll be looking at this differently 6 months from now. It may not even be an issue. It may not be the focus at that point. It could very well be that there is growing support and it's politically expedient for there to be more support put behind this. I mean, we need to go through a Supreme Court session with all of these justices and see where decisions lie. And that could be kind of go back to what Roosevelt did. Roosevelt basically, in trying to look at the issue of packing the court, put pressure on the Supreme Court. Now, of course, we're looking at this from the outside. We're looking at it at the distance of history. But some scholars look at it and say, yes, it did lead to the court being a little bit more open to some of the policies and the directions that Roosevelt was addressing in dealing with the national economic crisis. Biden is in his first term and possibly his only term. And is that going to be sufficient? Is that going to apply a similar kind of pressure to the Supreme Court where they don't become a lightning rod on particular issues that they see or could go maybe one way or the other? So we'll have to see. A lot of this depends on the issues that come forward. A lot of this depends on politics. And as this plays out, at the moment, I think the punt of getting this to a commission will give it some initial focus and debate about court packing, and it'll be politicized as you can see on both sides where people are coming out and discussing this and kind of attacking each other and so forth. That will be ongoing, but I think it will lessen as we look at other challenges that we're facing and other things that need to be addressed. And especially when we're talking about the Biden administration, and I hope to get back as we're, look at the 100-day review and we talk about what's been accomplished so far and what hasn't been and what issues continue to be very challenging for the nation and what are very highly charged political issues as we look ahead. I think that their focus is much more on governing through this crisis, through COVID, through the economic impact, through getting resources. Again, we will hopefully address that in the coming weeks to debate about the growth in spending in order to not only address the crisis, but also to look at infrastructure plans and things like that the Biden administration is proposing. So the Supreme Court packing a huge debate right now, very politicized on both sides, will continue to be, and it'll be interesting to see where we are with this 6 months from now. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will go back to something I introduced last week, and that was Senate Bill 7 coming out of the Texas legislature and talking about voting security, as some would say it. Whereas others are looking at this and concerned about what they say are voting restrictions. We'll be right back.
Politics can be confusing, but On Politics with Eric Morrow has your back. Follow the show on Facebook. Search On Politics with Eric Morrow to stay up to date with the show and all the sources to follow right along.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow. We're glad you're joining us today. In our first segment, we talked about Supreme Court packing And if you missed that, of course, you can catch it on SoundCloud after the show airs today. And it's a engaging issue at the moment, a topic of hot political conversation, something that may not go anywhere if we kind of read the tea leaves and examine a little bit the politics of it. But now I want to let's bring it back to Texas and what I introduced last week in talking about the move in the Texas legislature to address voting. And as some of you may know from what I said last week, but within a few weeks ago, Senate Bill 7 was passed, which would limit extended voting, early voting hours, prohibit drive-through voting, and make it illegal for local election officials to proactively send applications to vote by mail to voters if they qualify. Okay, some of this is focused on some of the practices that were in place by local election officials in the 2020 election. And of course, some of this is motivated politically by what some perceive as irregularities around the nation in that election. And an attempt to address this, an attempt to engage with constituents who are pushing their legislators to say, well, we need to do something about this. We're very much concerned about voter security. Where on the other side, you have people who are looking at this and saying, well, a lot of these local decisions that were made to facilitate the election were within election law as set by the state. They were where local authorities do have some latitude, not a significant amount, but some latitude. And they helped voting by those who may need alternative voting schedules or longer early voting hours or drive-through voting or expanded voting by mail because of COVID. So the debate is raging, of course, with our legislature being controlled by the Republican Party. This bill moved through the Senate. It's also moving through the House. And we would anticipate that there's going to be some ruling on this. Or not some ruling, some decision that will come out of the legislature and go to the governor that will make these adjustments to the Texas election code. Again, highly politicized in a number of ways, especially since now you've had a lot of corporations, first of all in Georgia, when they passed some new restrictions on voting, and in order, as they were saying there, to address voter security issues. And now in Texas, where you have corporations that are coming out affirming the access to vote and really casting a light on this in a negative way, that this is creating restrictions on voting, not enabling access, that the focus here is to, especially in states, a non-majority state like Texas that has a growing non-white population, we'd say non-Hispanic white, we'd say Hispanic population, Latino population, over against the non-Hispanic white population. So the concern is the access to voting, especially in large urban areas that are growing, and the attempts to get more people to vote, as we saw with this last election with the tremendous turnout. So before we get into a few more details on this, I do have a clip from Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who has come out against the critics of this, who are wanting to say that this is it's restricting voting. His focus is that we do need more voting security. We need more uniformity across the state. We need to be careful about what local officials can and can't do in order not to overextend on resources so that we can still ensure the integrity of the vote and, of course, voting security. This is Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick.
Senate Bill 7 is about voter security, not about voter suppression. And I'm tired of the lies and the nest of liars who continue to repeat them. Nothing has changed in the election code regarding early voting. Nothing has changed. We have more early voting than New York or New Jersey, which proudly added 9 days yesterday. So they're up to 9. Or 8 states, including Delaware, the home state of the president, that do not have early voting. So if somehow we're accused of being racist because we want to suppress the vote of people of color, I guess New York and New Jersey and Delaware are even more racist. Nothing has changed about election day voting in the election code. Mail-in ballots for seniors and people with disabilities has actually been loosened up. Under current law, until SB 7 passes, under current law, to verify a signature, you have to have 2 signatures dating back to 6 years. We've now required only 1 signature moving forward that can go back longer than 6 years because people's signatures change over time. So I want to repeat this. Nothing has changed for mail-in ballots, election day, or early voting.
All right. So those are the words of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick speaking to critics of Senate Bill 7 and other legislation that's being proposed where the debate is over voting restrictions or voting security. And of course, the lieutenant governor with many others in the legislature are emphasizing that this is all about voter security. And really what it does, when you look at it in terms of the practical application of it, it is tightening up the options that local officials have in conducting an election. Okay, I think that's where the focus is in what Dan Patrick is able to say, that we're not really changing any of this, although they are, because they're limiting the latitude that local officials have to try to facilitate voting at the local level. And so that's where the debate is, where he's saying, no, we're not changing it. Others are pointing and say, well, yes, you really are. You're taking options off the table. There are options that are not used by all counties and all election officials throughout the state of Texas. And so I think the concern there, on one hand, we could say it is legitimate, right? Because if local election officials have these options, then they have to be able to ensure the integrity of the vote in using those options. How is that monitored? Of course, the state law is there to kind of set the boundaries for local election officials. And so the concerns over in Harris County about mailing out ballot applications to all eligible voters. Again, how do you ensure? And I'm not on the inside of this. I served as a precinct worker or a voting center worker in the last election to get a little more insight into the practical side of it. But the challenge here is understanding how security is upheld within the options that can be used by local election officials. And so I think there's a legitimacy there on the one hand. I think this has become very politicized because, one, it is the response of an election that it appears for the most part throughout the country was conducted with high integrity, with high levels of security, high turnout, of course. And of course, if you look back on the history of election laws, you know that we've constantly made adjustments. There's constantly issues and things that come up that then challenge the kind of boundaries that are set in place. So it's not unusual to have that. It's just that in this highly politicized and partisan environment we're in, this became politicized to the point of, well, we need to do something. Because you have all these people who, no matter what the data says, no matter what state election returns said, what state officials are saying, what the Department of Homeland Security said regarding this past election, something was wrong because of the outcome that happened, at least in terms of the presidential race, right? Because here in Texas, the Republican Party maintained control of the legislature. They lost one seat in the Senate, which was expected, but it was not any kind of swing in any way. And so a lot of this focus, Trump won the general election in Texas for president. So but there's this angst. There's this concern that all these, what are being claimed as irregularities. And of course, if there are irregularities, they do need to be under the purview of state legislatures to look at these and to make changes to ensure voter security. And then on the other side, it's, okay, well, no, you're putting more restrictions in place. You've got a political agenda here. in which you are trying to keep people from voting by restricting hours and days and times and what local election officials can do to accommodate the populations within their jurisdiction in terms of offering the opportunity to vote. What's getting missed in this, and I kind of alluded to this last week, and it's why I wanted to get back to it, was, are we really looking at the practical aspects of administering an election in this day and age, given the millions upon millions, tens of millions of people that will vote around the country? Are we looking at this even at the state level in that way that says, okay, what is practical? What does work and doesn't work? Are we willing to kind of evaluate different options and to allow things to be done from time to time that expand voter access, that maybe facilitate voting? I mean, the fact that we have elections on a Tuesday, I mean, is that that's why early voting has come in many states like Texas. It's to give people the opportunity to vote on other days and at other times in advance of the day of the election. So I think that part of it is getting overlooked with the politics of this that are going back and forth, and also looking at, what is the evidence related to different practices that are being done at the local level that would invite voter fraud. Okay, does it actually have to happen before we do something about it? No. I would think that any new procedure, process, enhancement of voter access at the local level needs to have a review to see that it protects the integrity of the election. And so I think that's a critical thing here. And I think that needs more attention in this as well. But the reaction at this point is, let's take some of that freedom away. Let's take some of that latitude, let's use that word, that local election officials have in order to deliver the election. And let's make sure that this is more standardized throughout the state, maybe to tighten it up a little bit. Again, in Texas, it's a resource issue. Elections are very costly given the number of people that live in this state, the size of the state. And so we have to look at that as well. What is the cost of voter security in terms of the flexibility and the options that people have to vote at the local level? The only thing I want to say about this in closing on this issue is the aspect of corporations now kind of weighing in on this, and many of them in a general way of affirming voting access. This is something that's not uncommon in our politics, right? That corporations, companies weigh in on various issues. And we saw this in Texas. We've seen this with the transgender bathroom issue with various venues. We've seen this on other issues as well, where corporations try to use their weight a little bit and their influence, which they do in other areas as well. We can look at it in Texas in terms of taxation and the economic benefits of stimulus resources and grants that the state provides to encourage business growth and so forth. But here is an issue that has long been in the purview of state legislatures, of course, as well as the federal courts. If we look back, and of course, federal legislation, Voting Rights Act, and other major pieces of legislation that have expanded the right to vote over time. I think, again, that element of corporations, companies kind of weighing in on this adds to the politicization of it. Yes, we're all about, and we should all be, whatever side of the aisle anyone is on, we should be about voter access, but voter access with security and the integrity of the election emphasized as well. And I think that's where we have some challenges here, is that when corporations weigh in like that, they should be weighing in to ask the legislature to do their job. Right, as companies, as employers, as CEOs who are members of the society and so forth that have vested business interests and are concerned certainly about equality. The emphasis here is on on government doing its job to manage this properly, not to politicize it on a plane that ignores kind of the practical elements of it. And for me, I think there's a lot of practical aspects here of how we do elections that are just not the focus. I think there's some of it in the legislation, but I think that's being really overlooked and not being championed enough. And part of that is then, well, let's take our side. Let's take what aligns with our political agenda. Let's get out there in the media and the public, and let's push this forward so that we can gain support for our side and why this is wrong and this is right, or we should do it this way and not that way. So that concerns me as well, even though we know that goes on in politics. It will continue to be that way. But it doesn't seem as productive a focus in terms of the responsibility that the state has to deliver a fair and free election and voting access to the people. What that should be about is how can corporations, how can businesses and business leaders encourage the legislature to do its job in looking at this thoroughly, but then also on the other side of it, that they are offering solutions and options, and there's ways to help lawmakers look at this in terms of delivering elections that are that have the highest level of integrity and security. So we'll give this more attention as it moves through the Texas legislature. It looks like that it'll probably pass the House, that it will be the bill will go to a joint committee in preparation for a final version that would go back through both chambers, and then, of course, on to the governor, and most likely will be passed, again, putting in more standardization and some restrictions on what local officials can do in upcoming elections. We're going to take another quick break, and we will come back for our last two segments, and that's a look back at the energy crisis that we had earlier this year and what may be in store for us going ahead unless some of this is fixed, and then also talking very briefly about some of the front runners, at least in terms of fundraising, for the 2024 GOP presidential nomination. We'll be right back.
T for Texas is a Texas-based history podcast from historian Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. Find a new episode every Thursday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow, and we're glad you're joining us today. This is one of those catch-all shows where we're trying to bring you up to date on a few issues and look at some things that need to be in front of you in the world of politics and policy. Of course, today we focused on packing the Supreme Court. We have focused on voting restrictions or voting security in Texas, depending on how you look at that issue. I think it's a little bit of both. And now we turn to, in the last part of the show, I've got two issues that I want to deal with, one in Texas and one on the national level. But first of all, this past week, Texans were asked to conserve electricity because the supply of power could barely keep up with demand. And wow, this raises concerns, right? Especially when we're looking at summer just around the corner. And we know that in Texas that summer can be hot, it can be dry, it can be not much wind to help cool us off. And so what does this mean going forward, and what are the issues? Well, a part of this concern was due to power plants that have been offline due to maintenance. And some of this being the result of the winter storm we had, which created that massive failure across the state in our electrical power grid. If you were with us in February, our episode that aired on February 28th, we interviewed Dr. Ann Eggleston, the director of the Center for Environmental Studies here at Tarleton State University. And we talked about how this is set up and Texas having its own grid and what really led to these extreme temperatures that caused the failures, because the electrical providers were not prepared for that type of weather for an extended period of time, and thus this collapse of the energy grid in the state. So with that fresh in our minds and just having happened a few months ago, now we are hearing, okay, conserve. Our grid can barely keep up. Well, okay, one part of this is the damage that was caused and the need to get things fully back operational, repaired, in order to handle the demand in Texas. But there is some concern about the summer in the state, especially that severe weather could cause, and we're talking about extreme weather here, hot weather, severe drought, low winds, so those wind turbines don't turn, could lead to more power outages. And so this is being looked at now, certainly by the Texas legislature, as they look at what needs to be done to bring the grid up to operations that will meet the demand, the growing demand in this state that continues to have population growth and business growth that then needs more power. But there are a couple of scenarios here that have come out from ERCOT. If you remember ERCOT, which is the Reliability Council that manages this on behalf of the state. And there are three scenarios that are possible for this summer and that they're attempting to look at to say, okay, what would be the outcome here? So the first scenario involves drought, similar to what the state saw in 2011, combined with low winds, several natural gas plants offline, and an increase in economic activity as the pandemic eases, could leave the power grid short by 3,600 megawatts, or enough to power 720,000 homes. Okay, so that definitely has an impact when you're talking about that many homes. It could be possible. The second, add low solar power generation to that first projection, so a cloudy day, and the grid would be short 7,500 megawatts, or enough to power 1.5 million homes. Okay, that number just doubled, right? Number of homes that are not powered because of low wind, low solar, with a few other plants offline due to either the damages or in the way that they rotate and manage all of this. The most extreme scenario that is being looked at by ERCOT is a severe heat wave across the entire state, combined with outages for every major power source, would leave the grid short 14,000 megawatts, or enough to power 2.8 million homes. Okay, so this gets to that more severe case, and they're looking at these scenarios to say, okay, how do we address and overcome them? So what happened this past week is that Texas's grid supply and demand and the balance of it fell below the safety margin of 2,300 megawatts in excess supply. Okay, so the grid was producing excess, which it always does, and that excess is there as a precaution. That came down to the level that they say, wait a minute, this is not going in the right direction, and thus additional precautions are kick in according to ERCOT policy and how they manage this, so that they don't have the massive failure that we saw earlier in the year. So there are debates going on. What about these scenarios? What is the chance of them occurring? Of course, we look back in February at what happened. Of course, that was not expected, and it happened, and we weren't prepared. It's very clear that we weren't prepared for the results of it, and what caused that catastrophic event that left so many people without power, many for days. The ERCOT will be coming out with a final summer assessment by May 6th that will then include these scenarios, and we'll look at what recommendations and options that they have in the state in order to address the possibility of these things happening. So it's something that we all need, I think, to be aware of. We need to be aware of the role government has. I think we focused on this back with our interview with Dr. Eggleston, where we talked about the legislature, the governor, the role that ERCOT has with the in managing this, and how government should be addressing such a critical need. I mean, the fact that we're so dependent on electrical power. And there are so many things, businesses as well, in terms of their operations, gas stations, and our homes, of course. And of course, certainly our medical facilities. And of course, some of these things have backup resources, but those are not meant for an extended period of time. They're meant to get through a very short crises to then provide whatever services that need to be maintained for the health and well-being. So we'll look at this. Right now, these scenarios are not as likely because some of the projections from the NOAA and from other weather sources are looking ahead and saying that we will have above average temperatures, but is it going to be a heat wave? Is it going to be drought? Is it going to be low wind? I think based on what we experienced in February, we need to be prepared for all of these things. Now, in this last segment of the show today, I want to turn to the presidential race for 2024. And we may be going, wow, we just finished an election. We have an administration that's nearing its 100 days in office. Why start looking ahead? Well, it's because in the world of politics, that race never really ends. We get a pause occasionally after various elections, but the race itself never really ends. And of course, with the loss of President Donald Trump in the election, people began positioning themselves. And we've seen that. And I wanted to bring to our attention several people, and some of these names will be familiar, but they are people who are out in front and are fundraising and are positioning themselves. One that has come to the forefront in recent weeks is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who has begun raising funds and really having people come to him and organizations come to him that have resources and are looking at him as, in fact, I saw a Politico article said that a nicer version of Donald Trump. He's being looked at along with former Vice President Mike Pence, who is out there. But does he have the ability to draw the kinds of resources that some of these other candidates, now potential candidates? So as the Republican Party looks at this going forward, national donor interest, as several articles have pointed out, is very, very much interested in Governor DeSantis. They're lining up to support his reelection effort in 2022, which would be a good opportunity for him to be on not just the state, but national stage, and then to position himself for 2024. We've seen in interviews that have been conducted among contributors and fundraisers in the Republican Party that this focus is shifting to DeSantis and looking at him not just because of Florida, but by many throughout the country as having a major political future in the Republican Party. So DeSantis, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who will be up for re-election in 2022, is a prominent name in the field. A couple of other names that may seem a little more familiar if you followed the show and you followed the election politics, and that is Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Missouri Senator Josh Hawley. Both of these had their names out there and have been vying for position within the party, especially since the election. But they are already, as we see from the numbers, are leading the pack in first quarter contributions. Cruz brought in $3.6 million to his Senate reelection committee, which has reported having $5.6 million in cash on hand. Hawley has $3 million in receipts with $3.1 million on hand. Now, why is that important? neither one of these senators are up for reelection until 2024. And so already they have outpaced many, many others in terms of fundraising for their reelection, which of course could be channeled into a presidential bid. Close behind are a few other names that might sound familiar. Senator Rand Paul and Marco Rubio. Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, Marco Rubio from Florida. Paul has raised $1.9 million and has $3.1 million on hand. Rubio reported $1.6 million in the first quarter with $3.9 million in cash on hand. So again, you have two people, and some of the politics of this are people looking at, well, did they vote to overturn the election or not? Paul and Rubio did not. Of course, Cruz and Hawley did. So they certainly are favorites among Trump followers. But Rubio and Paul are in the mix as well. And if we look at this early on in this process, these are, I think, some of the names to watch. Now, we are so far out from a presidential election, or at least from the beginning of the primary process in the year leading up to the election, that there could be a whole host of other names of people who come forward and who rise to the top through the midterm elections, through whatever crisis or policy issues that are addressed on the national level. There is still plenty of time. But it is interesting to look at some of these, and depending on their relationship or alignment with the Trump administration and where they may be in terms of their ability to raise money. Again, this is going to be a focus, as it is in every presidential election, and that is resources. How do you raise the hundreds of millions of dollars that are needed in order to fund a campaign? Now, we saw a little unconventional approach with President Trump in his campaigns, but we will certainly be back, I think, to seeing the need for those resources. So this is an area that we'll track. We'll be looking at those names as they come forward. We'll be watching to see, especially on the Democrat side, because Biden had said about being a one-term president. Does that mean they're going to be front runners moving forward as we move further through his administration? But those are the things that you can listen to On Politics and learn more about each week, right here on KTRL 90.5 FM. We thank you for joining us this week. Be sure to follow our Facebook page. That's On Politics with Eric Morrow for related articles, news, and information. And you can also listen to previous sessions of the show on SoundCloud. Again, thank you for joining us for this episode of On Politics.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from me, Taylor Welch.
And me, Carissa Cole.
Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.